Every mother knows that one day her children will grow up. But no one prepares you for the day your own child looks you in the eyes and says, "You're not welcome in my home anymore." And certainly no one prepares you for the day he marches you into a courtroom, accusing you, his own mother, of disturbing his family's privacy. I'm 78 years old, and the moment the judge read his final words, my son's face turned white. His wife began to cry. And the entire courtroom went silent. I never wanted any of this. All I wanted was to see my grandchildren. My name is Margaret Collins, and today, I'm finally ready to tell this story. My story doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins many years earlier, in a little terraced house in Sheffield, England, a humble place with creaky floorboards and pebble-dashed walls, where the windows fogged up every winter morning, and the radiators rattled like nervous bones whenever the heat kicked in. It was the sort of house where life felt close. Neighbors shouting friendly greetings from across narrow gardens, children skipping rope on the pavement, and the familiar sound of Mr. Turner next door, coughing as he smoked his evening pipe. You could smell the coal fires burning on every street, a thick, smoky scent that settled into your hair, and somehow made the nights feel warmer. Inside our home, the kettle never stopped whistling. It was always ready, a constant companion, letting out that cheerful, sharp note that danced through the kitchen, as if it had something important to say. My mother kept it on almost all day, making tea for anyone who walked through the door. Visitors didn't need to knock back then. A simple hello as the door pushed open was enough. The kitchen smelled of yeast and warm dough every Sunday, because my mother believed that bread wasn't just food. It was comfort, tradition, and welcome all baked into one. She kneaded it slowly, rhythmically, with her sleeves rolled up and her cheeks flushed from the heat of the oven. I can still see the flour dust floating through the sunlight, like tiny snowflakes suspended in time. Those early days felt safe. The world outside was still healing from the war. And so were we. Patching life together with borrowed sugar, shared casseroles, and neighbors who looked out for one another without being asked. We didn't have much, but we had enough. And enough was plenty. I was born in 1947. Right into that mix of resilience and quiet hope. My childhood was stitched together. From simple fabrics, second-hand dresses, hand-knit cardigans, and the laughter that echoed around our small home. Whenever my mother played her old gramophone, the neighborhood children and I spent every summer running through the alleys, drawing hopscotch grids with stolen bits of chalk, and picking dandelions as if they were treasures. I remember the sound of my father's boots as he walked home from the steelworks. A firm, steady rhythm that told us everything was all right in the world. Years later, in the summer of 1968, I married my husband, Thomas. To this day, I can still picture him standing at the end of the church aisle, his suit slightly too big, his tie crooked, and that smile, that soft, gentle smile, that made me feel like I was stepping into a future filled with light. He wasn't flashy or loud. No, Thomas was the sort of man who fixed wobbly table legs without being asked, who hummed while he shaved, who touched your cheek like it was fragile porcelain. When we baked together in our tiny kitchen, he'd brush flour off my face with the back of his finger, laughing softly, like he couldn't quite believe his luck. Our early marriage felt like a film reel, running in warm sepia tones. Fridays at the dance hall, where Thomas would try, and fail, to keep rhythm during the quickstep. And I would laugh so loudly people turned to look. Saturdays at the market, the air filled with the scent of fresh produce and rain. Our hands clasped together as we wandered through the stalls, looking for ripe tomatoes and discounted meat. Sundays were my favorite. Slow, gentle days, filled with the rich aroma of roast beef, the clinking of teacups, and the quiet comfort of being together. By 1973, our first child arrived. Andrew. My sweet, quiet boy. With those big brown eyes that seemed far too wise for a newborn. He had a habit. A tiny, precious habit. Of gripping my finger with such determination. You'd think he feared the whole world might sweep him away. If he let go. Life became a rhythm after that. A soft, steady heartbeat of routine. The hum of the washing machine, as it rattled in the corner. The scent of lavender drifting in from the small garden we tended together. The smudged chalk drawings Andrew made on the pavement. Each one a little masterpiece that the rain would wash away. Long before I was ready to see them go. We were happy. Not extraordinary, not wealthy, not perfect. Just happy in that honest, everyday way. That makes you believe the world is good. And then, in 1980, our second child arrived. Rebecca. Oh, Rebecca came into this world. With curls, giggles, and curious questions. Pouring out of her like sunshine. Even the midwife said she had a glow about her. And Thomas, holding her tiny body in his arms, whispered, "She's pure sunshine, Maggie. Look, she's brought the whole morning with her." I thought those early years would last forever. The sticky fingerprints on the walls. The squeals of laughter at bath time. The bedtime stories read with tired voices. But full hearts. Those were the years I felt most alive. Before the money worries crept in. Before Thomas started coming home late. Before the loneliness crept into the corners of our home. Like a slow, cold fog. Before I learned that even the strongest families can unravel thread by thread, without anybody noticing at first. But even in those golden days, life leaves signs. Little warnings. Soft, almost invisible threads. That begin to pull loose over time. Threads you only recognize in hindsight. The extra hour Thomas spent at work. The too tight smile when I asked about the bills. The distant look in his eyes. When he thought I wasn't watching. I just didn't see them yet. Or perhaps I didn't want to. Because when a mother feels safe, she convinces herself that safety will last forever. The first clues surfaced on a rainy Tuesday in 1987, one of those wet, gray English days where the clouds seemed to hang so low you felt as though you could reach up and wipe the sky clean with the sleeve of your jumper. It was the kind of rain that didn't simply fall but settled into everything, soaking through coats, finding its way into shoes, making the air feel heavy and swollen with unspoken thoughts. I remember standing by the kitchen window, wiping steam from the glass with the hem of my cardigan as I waited for Thomas to come home. The kettle had started its soft whistle, just a hint at first, rising slowly as if complaining about being forgotten. The house was filled with the warm, comforting smell of beef stew simmering on the stove, a scent that had followed our family through years of love, arguments, celebrations, and ordinary Tuesdays. Upstairs, the children added their own small notes to the evening, Andrew scribbling away at his homework with the seriousness of a boy determined to make his father proud, and little Rebecca humming to her dolls, her sweet, airy voice drifting down the stairs like the last bright petal clinging stubbornly to a wilting flower. Everything felt familiar, predictable, safe. But then the front door creaked open, and something in the air shifted. Thomas stepped inside, drenched from the rain, his hair matted to his forehead, droplets clinging to his eyelashes, his coat hanging heavily from his shoulders. He looked like a man who had walked not just through a storm, but through something far darker, something that tightened around him like a weight he couldn't shrug off. His shirt was rumpled in a way that reminded me of his younger days, back when he was careless with his clothes but full of laughter and mischief. His tie was loosened, his briefcase was clutched to his chest as if it carried something fragile, something precious or dangerous or both. And his eyes, those tired, distant eyes that avoided mine. "Love, you're late today," I said softly, trying to speak with the same gentle ease I had used for nearly 2 decades of marriage. He leaned down and pressed a kiss to my forehead, but it felt hollow, like a gesture performed by a man remembering the motions but forgetting their meaning. "Meetings," he muttered, not quite meeting my gaze, his voice strained, as if his words were squeezing past a truth stuck in his throat. He walked upstairs for a shower, his footsteps heavier than usual, each step sounding like a decision he couldn't take back. I stood quietly, listening to the bathroom door click shut, listening to the soft rush of water start. And then, as I set bowls of stew onto the counter, I heard it, faint but unmistakable. A sob. A small, fractured sound that slipped under the bathroom door like steam searching for escape. It wasn't the cry of a man in physical pain or the grunt of someone annoyed. It was a wounded, broken sob, the kind of sound that shatters something inside the person who hears it. Thomas Collins, my solid, steady, rarely shaken Thomas, was crying alone in the shower. Men of his generation didn't cry. They held their pain behind clenched jaws and stiff postures. But that evening, beneath the hiss of hot water, my husband cried like someone who had run out of places to hide. I almost knocked. Almost asked him what was wrong. But something in me held back, a chill in my stomach, a quiet voice whispering that the weight he carried was heavier than anything I could lift for him. Life resumed its rhythm over the next days and weeks, but a quiet unease began threading its way through the fabric of our home. The second clue appeared a few weeks later, on a Saturday morning that felt wrong before anything even happened. Thomas had left early, saying he needed to swing by the office, though he never worked weekends. That alone sent a ripple of concern through me. As I tidied the hallway, humming softly to myself, I noticed his coat draped over the banister. I reached into the pocket, expecting the usual clutter, old receipts, loose change, bits of string. But my fingers brushed against an envelope. It was smooth, crisp, almost new. No name. No address. Just a P.O. box number printed neatly in the corner. A shiver slid down my spine. I opened it with the caution of someone afraid of what they might find. Inside was a single receipt. £500. £500. In those days, it was a sum large enough to alter the direction of a month, large enough to help pay off debts, fix broken things, buy new school shoes, or put aside for emergencies. But here it was, unaccounted for. Unexplained. Unattached to any detail. When Thomas returned later that day, I waited until the children were busy playing in the next room. My hands trembled slightly as I held up the envelope. "Thomas," I began softly, "I found something in your coat." His shoulders stiffened. His jaw tightened. He took a slow breath before smiling at me, not his real smile, not the warm, easy one that had charmed me since I was 21, but a tight, cautious smile. A smile of someone performing innocence, not living it. Just helping a colleague, Maggie. Nothing more. His words sounded prepared, like he'd practiced them on the drive home. I wanted to ask more, to dig deeper, but fear held me back. Sometimes, when you love someone, you choose ignorance over pain. But ignorance doesn't stay quiet for long. More clues surfaced. Small ones at first. A phone call he took outside in the biting November cold, pacing across the garden with the cord stretched taut, his breath making little clouds in the night air while he spoke in a low, urgent tone. A late-night drive to clear his head, though Thomas was not a man who drove without purpose, he preferred routine, home, quiet evenings. And then the letter. That small, pale blue envelope he received on a Thursday evening. He tried to hide the way his hands shook when he slid it into his pocket, but I saw, wives always see. He didn't read it in the kitchen or the living room. He didn't read it in bed. He walked straight to the fireplace, pulled out his pocket knife, slit it open, read it with trembling fingers, and then tossed the letter into the flames. I stood behind him, invisible in the doorway, watching him watch the paper turn black. He didn't notice me. Or maybe he did, and that was worse. The silence in our home grew heavier. But he still came home every night. Still kissed the children goodnight, still held me with arms that felt familiar but distant, as though he were holding a memory rather than a wife. I tried desperately to believe it was all in my head. Marriages go through strange seasons, I told myself. But deep down, I knew something was coming, something dark, something inevitable. And then came the night Thomas didn't come home. No message. No explanation. No footsteps on the path. Just an empty doorway and a silence so loud it pressed against my chest like a hand trying to crush my heart. That night shattered the illusion I'd fought so hard to keep. That night marked the beginning of a truth I never wanted to see. That night began the unraveling of everything I thought I knew about my husband, my marriage, and the life we'd built together. Because those clues, those scattered, fearful clues, weren't just coincidences. They were breadcrumbs. And they were leading me straight into a secret that would break my world in half. It was a police officer who knocked on my door, one of those soft, hesitant knocks that don't sound like visitors or neighbors but something heavier, something that makes the air turn cold before you even reach the hallway. When I opened the door, I saw a young man standing there in the rain, his hat dripping, his uniform slightly too big for his narrow shoulders, and his eyes were the kind that carried more sorrow than authority. "Mrs. Collins, there's been an accident," he said, and though his voice barely rose above a whisper, it felt like it shattered the quiet safety of my little home. The kettle behind me continued to hum on the stove, and somewhere in the distance, Rebecca's laughter floated down the stairs, unaware that our lives had just shifted forever. I don't remember grabbing my handbag, I don't remember turning off the stove. I only remember the drive to the hospital, the way my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly they trembled, the way the wipers struggled against the heavy Yorkshire rain, smearing the world outside into streaks of gray and white. My heart thudded like it was trying to outrun time itself. When I stepped into the hospital, that strange, sterile smell of antiseptic and warm plastic hit me instantly, the kind of scent you only associate with grief or fear. A nurse led me through long corridors where the lights buzzed faintly overhead, flickering like tired fireflies. And then I saw him. My Thomas. The strong man who once lifted me effortlessly during our wedding dance, lying so small beneath a sheet, his skin pale as parchment, tubes and wires surrounding him like a cruel kind of web. The sight of him stole the air from my lungs. I walked closer, and my footsteps felt strangely heavy, as if grief had already taken hold of my ankles. When I reached his bedside, he opened his eyes, just barely, and the faintest hint of recognition flickered there. He reached for my hand, and when his fingers touched mine, they trembled as though the effort alone drained what little strength he had left. "Maggie," he breathed, and his voice was fragile, thin, like old paper tearing. "There are things I should have told you years ago." I felt the room tilt ever so slightly, as though the floor was no longer steady beneath me. His thumb brushed the back of my hand, slow, shaky strokes that broke my heart because this was the same man who once held my hand so confidently as we crossed the river bridge on our honeymoon, who once steadied me when I was pregnant with Andrew and too dizzy to stand. Now he looked like a ghost of himself. Tears welled in his eyes, sliding down the side of his face and disappearing into his pillow. I opened my mouth to speak, to tell him he didn't need to explain anything right now, that he just needed to rest, but my voice refused to come. My throat felt tight, as if his pain had reached into my chest and gripped me too. "I've been helping someone," he whispered, each word costing him more breath than the last. "A woman, and a child." The words drifted into the room like smoke, thin, dark, suffocating. My heart lurched. For a moment, the beeping machines faded, and all I could hear was the pounding in my ears. The world seemed to shrink around us, the hospital walls pulsing with the weight of a truth I had never imagined. It wasn't an affair, he rushed out, as much as a dying man could rush. I swear it. I swear it on every year we shared. But I made a mistake. A long time ago. Before you. A mistake that resulted in a child who never had a father. I felt heat rise in my chest, confusion, fear, heartbreak all tangled together. The receipts. The P.O. box. The letters he burned. The late-night drives. Every unanswered question I had tucked away, every suspicion I had soothed myself out of, suddenly they snapped into place like cruel, jagged puzzle pieces. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice so thin it barely felt like mine. He looked at me with such sorrow it almost hurt to meet his eyes. I didn't want to lose you, he whispered, his fingers curling around mine with what little strength he had left. I thought I could fix everything quietly. I thought I could protect you from the shame of what I'd done. His chest rose and fell unevenly, each breath shorter, harsher, like his body was fighting a battle it had already lost. He looked like a man drowning on dry land. I wanted to tell you, he said again, as if repeating it could somehow undo the years of silence. And then his hand slipped slightly against mine. The monitors began to beep erratically, sharp and urgent. A nurse rushed in, followed by a doctor, and suddenly I was pushed gently but firmly away. Please wait outside, Mrs. Collins, someone said, but their voice felt distant, muffled, like it was echoing down a long tunnel. I stood in the corridor, staring at the closed door, my heart pounding in my ears. People rushed past me, but all I could hear was Thomas's last trembling confession replaying over and over in my mind. I didn't know how long I stood there. Seconds, hours, it all blended together. Then a doctor emerged, his expression heavy, resigned, the kind of expression that says everything before he even begins to speak. I'm so sorry, he said softly. And those 3 words split something open inside me. Thomas died that night. A part of me died with him. Some secrets died with him. Others lived on, their shadows stretching far beyond that hospital corridor, reaching into the years that followed, shaping a future I never expected to face alone. The weeks after Thomas's funeral were a haze, the kind of haze that settles over a person so thickly that even the simplest tasks, boiling water, folding laundry, opening the curtains, feel like lifting stones. I drifted through the days like a woman caught between worlds, not yet fully part of the living but unable to follow the dead. Andrew, only 14, retreated into a silence so heavy it frightened me. He stopped spending time in the kitchen where he used to chatter while I cooked, stopped playing football with his friends in the park, and stopped doing anything that reminded him of the life we had before Thomas's accident. I would hear him in the early mornings, awake long before dawn, sitting in the living room with his father's old radio pressed close to his ear, letting static-filled music play just so the house didn't feel so empty. Rebecca, sweet little Rebecca, cried each night in her small lavender-painted bedroom, curled beneath the quilt her grandmother had made. She clutched Thomas's old wool sweater, the one he always wore while fixing things around the house, and she'd fall asleep with her tiny fingers gripping the sleeve as though if she held on tightly enough, she could somehow keep him from fading. The air in the house felt different. Heavy. Quiet. As though grief had seeped into the walls and settled into the floorboards. Bills began to pile up on the small table by the door, gas bills, electricity, school fees, and every envelope felt like another stone added to an already unbearable weight. Debt letters arrived with red warnings stamped across the front, each one more urgent than the last. I took on whatever work I could find, scrubbing other people's floors, polishing brass fixtures in hotels, washing linen until my knuckles cracked and bled. I worked long hours and came home bone-tired, smelling of bleach and metal and exhaustion, but I kept going because the children needed warmth, food, stability, anything to keep them anchored during a time when everything else felt like it was slipping away. Then one cold afternoon in early winter, when the wind rattled the windows and the house felt colder than usual, a letter arrived addressed to me in handwriting I didn't recognize. My stomach tightened before I even opened it, as though some part of me already knew this envelope would change something. Inside was a short note: "Mrs. Collins, I believe we share a connection. I hope we can speak." And tucked behind it was a small photograph of a young woman, no more than 17, with Thomas's unmistakable eyes. His eyes. The same warm brown with that gentle, downward slant at the corners that always made him look kind, even when he was tired or stressed. Seeing those eyes on another child, one I had never known, never met, tore something inside me open all over again, as if grief had circled back for a second round. I didn't hate her. I couldn't. She looked innocent, uncertain, almost apologetic in the photograph, as though she knew her very existence carried a history of pain she had no part in choosing. She was just a child caught in a story she didn't ask to be written into. But Andrew, oh, Andrew. He saw her differently. He saw her as the living reminder of the truth revealed on the night his father died, a truth he wasn't ready to forgive. In his young mind, grief mixed with anger, and anger needed a target. And she became that target. The letters continued for a while, gentle, hesitant messages from the girl's mother, then from the girl herself, but Andrew recoiled every time her name was mentioned. Rebecca, still young and tender-hearted, simply looked confused. Years passed, and the wounds we carried didn't heal so much as harden, forming tough, emotional scar tissue. The house became quieter still, the conversations shorter, the laughter rarer. As my children grew taller, more independent, a subtle distance began to form between us, a distance I didn't recognize at first because it happened slowly, quietly, like the thinning of fabric that eventually tears. I aged, too. My hands, once so capable and strong, became wrinkled and spotted. My hair turned silver, soft at the temples. My knees began to ache when winter came, and the cold settled deep into my bones. I was no longer the young wife bustling around the kitchen, no longer the mother carrying toddlers on each hip. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being the center of Andrew's world. Instead, I became someone he visited out of obligation, someone he spoke to politely rather than warmly, someone whose presence no longer comforted him but seemed to irritate him in ways I never understood. A guest in my own son's life. A guest he tolerated, until he didn't. The lowest point wasn't the poverty, though that came with its own quiet humiliation. It wasn't the loneliness, though the silence of an empty house can be louder than a scream. It wasn't even the grief of losing Thomas, even though some nights, I still reached out across the bed expecting to feel him there. No. The lowest point came years later, long after life had steadied itself into a quieter routine. It came on a dull autumn afternoon, when the leaves blew across Andrew's driveway and I had stopped by with a basket of scones I had baked, something I used to do when he was little, something that once made his face light up. He opened the door, looked at the basket, then looked at me with an expression that was neither warm nor welcoming. His voice was cold, clipped, far too sharp for the boy I had raised. "You're too involved in our lives, Mum," he said, as though reading from a script he'd rehearsed. "You show up unannounced. You interfere. It needs to stop." The words pierced me in a way I wasn't prepared for. I had always imagined that one day my children would grow up and drift away a little, that's the nature of life, but never did I imagine hearing my son speak to me like I was an inconvenience, a burden, a problem to be managed. Standing there on his doorstep, holding a basket that suddenly felt too heavy, I had never felt so small. So unnecessary. So heartbreakingly out of place in the life of the boy I once rocked to sleep. And in that moment, something inside me quietly broke. When you are left with nothing, you learn to build from scraps. That's what I had to do after the years of grief, the months of uncertainty, and the long nights when I could barely remember to eat or sleep. Life had stripped me of the man I loved, the security we had fought for together, and even the closeness of my eldest son, whose coldness cut deeper than any absence of money or companionship could have. But in the quiet that followed, I realized something crucial: survival required action, not sorrow. I had to start over, in whatever small ways I could manage, and I had to remind myself that even scraps, small, broken, seemingly worthless pieces, could be made into something meaningful with patience and effort. So, in my late 50s, when my knees ached and my hair had started to streak with silver, I began learning bookkeeping. I remember sitting at the old typewriter in the corner of the room I had turned into a small office, my hands trembling over the keys as I tried to make sense of numbers, columns, and accounts. The first week was humiliating. The figures seemed to float on the page, refusing to obey, and I typed with such hesitation that it felt as if each letter took a lifetime to appear. But I kept going. Slowly, laboriously, I began to understand, and the rhythm of balancing ledgers and adding columns became strangely comforting. It was a quiet rebellion against the helplessness I had felt for so long, a way to remind myself that I was still capable, still useful, still alive. Alongside that, I joined a local sewing circle. It was something I had always meant to do when I was younger, but never found the time, trapped as I had been in the cycles of raising children and managing a household. At first, I felt awkward among the women, most of whom had known each other for years. Their needles clicked and fabrics folded perfectly, their chatter a gentle hum of shared memories and small victories. I felt clumsy and out of place, but gradually, the women welcomed me. We shared stories over cups of tea, laughed over botched seams and uneven hems, and I felt something I hadn't in years: genuine connection. Laughter returned to my life in soft waves, like sunlight sneaking through a cloudy window. It was a slow warmth, a balm to the rawness inside me. By the time I turned 65, I found another way to give and receive joy: volunteering at the local community center. Every week, I would sit on the floor with children whose grandparents lived too far away to visit or whose parents were caught in the relentless grind of work. I read them stories, animated tales of faraway lands, talking animals, and brave heroes who always found a way through their troubles. Their faces, wide-eyed and earnest, reminded me of my own children when they were little, and for a few precious hours, I could almost forget the years of sorrow, the tension with Andrew, and the feeling of being invisible in the life I had built alone. In those moments, I felt needed again, and that need became a small, steady flame inside me, warming the shadowed corners of my heart. At 68, I did something else I had never imagined I would do: I learned to drive. Yes, I was late to it, far later than most, but it was a milestone of freedom. Sitting behind the wheel, feeling the car respond to my hands, the open road ahead stretching out with possibilities, it felt like reclaiming a piece of life that had long been denied to me. The world seemed larger, less confining, and I could go where I wanted without needing permission, without fear of being stopped or ignored. Driving gave me independence, a quiet triumph in the face of years of dependency and isolation. Meanwhile, life brought new joys as well. My daughter Rebecca, now grown, married a gentleman named Peter, who treated me with the warmth and respect of a son I had never had. From the moment we met, he included me in his life, never making me feel like an outsider or a burden. And when Lily and James were born, those two bright, laughing children, my days began to fill with light again. They became the sunshine of my older years, bringing energy and wonder to mornings that would otherwise have been quiet and lonely. With them, I played, told stories, baked cookies, and found laughter echoing through the house in ways I hadn't heard since Thomas was alive. Slowly, over time, I began to heal. I wasn't wealthy, I wasn't famous, and I didn't do anything extraordinary in the eyes of the world, but I was alive, capable of love, and learning that life, in its simplest forms, could still hold beauty. And yet, even as the warmth of Rebecca's family and my grandchildren filled my heart, a cold corner of it still ached for Andrew. He drifted further with each passing year. I tried to reach him, quietly, gently, visiting with small gifts, calling on special occasions, showing interest without judgment, but it never seemed enough. His wife, Claire, who had grown distant and protective of her own family unit, did not welcome my visits. I always knocked first. I always announced myself. I always brought gifts, little gestures meant to bridge the distance, to say, I still care, I still want to be part of your life. And yet, somehow, my presence was always too much. The door would open, his eyes would flicker briefly with something, surprise, irritation, maybe guilt, and I would sense immediately that I was intruding. Too many words, too many questions, too much of the life that had shaped him before the bitterness and resentment had taken root. And in those moments, standing on the threshold of a home that was no longer fully mine to enter, I felt the sting of being unwanted, the ache of a mother who had given everything yet was seen as intrusive rather than cherished. My heart, though healed in many ways, learned again the sharp edges of rejection, reminding me that even love is not always returned as we hope. And so, life continued, a mixture of small triumphs, tiny joys, and quiet sorrows, each day teaching me resilience, patience, and the bittersweet truth that growing older can bring both warmth and coldness in equal measure, that even in the golden years, one can experience love, loss, laughter, and the complicated, often painful, beauty of human relationships, where the people you love most may sometimes be the ones who hurt you without meaning to, and where healing is a journey, not a destination, filled with victories large and small, scraps turned into something meaningful, and the ever-present hope that the heart, no matter how bruised, can still expand to welcome life again. The day I got the court summons, my heart nearly stopped, as if the envelope itself carried a blow powerful enough to knock the breath from my chest. I had been sorting laundry at the kitchen table, folding Rebecca's children's small shirts that she'd sent over for mending, when the knock came, sharp, official, nothing like the gentle taps of neighbors or the hurried raps of postmen on cold mornings. I opened the door expecting a parcel, perhaps something Rebecca ordered and sent to my address, but instead it was a stern-faced courier holding a cream envelope stamped with the unforgiving mark of the county court. My fingers trembled as I signed for it, and by the time the door clicked shut behind me, my knees were already weak. I set the envelope down gently, as though it might detonate if handled too roughly, and for a long moment I simply stared at it, the edges warped slightly from the dampness outside. When I finally tore it open, the room seemed to tilt, the words blurring as my eyes filled with a sting I tried to blink away. Andrew had filed a complaint, repeated intrusion and disturbance of household privacy. My own son, the boy I had held against my chest after nightmares, the boy I had nursed through fevers, the boy who once clung to my skirt in crowded rooms, had dragged me into court like a stranger causing trouble. I felt something inside me crumble, something soft and maternal that had survived grief, poverty, loneliness, and the betrayal of secrets long buried, but now wavered under the weight of this new wound. I arrived in court the next week wearing my best coat, the navy wool one with the missing button I had sewn back carefully the night before, as if stitching it perfectly would somehow give me strength. My hands shook so badly while I signed in that the bailiff, a young man with kind eyebrows, gently took my elbow and helped me to a seat, his voice a soft murmur in the echoing room that smelled faintly of dust and old paper. Andrew sat across the room, his jaw clenched tight in that stubborn way he used to push through math homework, only now it was hardened, sharpened by resentment. His eyes refused to meet mine, staying glued to the papers in his lap as though acknowledging me would crack the mask he wore. Claire sat beside him, her lips pursed, whispering sharply into his ear, her hand gripping his arm with a possessiveness that stung more than I expected. They looked like a team, united, firm, unyielding, and I sat alone, clutching my handbag like a lifeline. When the judge asked for my statement, I rose slowly, feeling the weight of every year in my bones, my heartbeat pounding like a frightened drum. I cleared my throat, though my voice still came out thin at first. My lord, I'm just a mother who wanted to see her grandchildren. I never forced myself into their home. Every visit was out of love, not intrusion. My voice wavered, not weak, not apologetic, but human, carrying decades of love and heartbreak, of raising 2 children with a man who had left me with more mysteries than memories. I could feel Andrew shift slightly, but he kept his head bowed, as though my words were too heavy to look at. And then something happened that none of us expected, a soft knock at the courtroom door, followed by the entrance of a young woman whose presence stole every ounce of air from the room. Emily. Thomas's other daughter. The girl from the old photograph I had received all those years ago in the envelope that tore my life apart for the second time. She walked with purpose, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted in a quiet bravery that reminded me painfully of Thomas's youth. She handed a document to the bailiff, then turned to the judge. "My lord," she said, her voice clear but trembling at the edges, "I'd like to speak on Mrs. Collins's behalf." Andrew's face drained of color, his lips parting in shock, and Claire's nails dug into his arm as if silently ordering him to stay quiet. The judge adjusted his glasses and nodded for her to continue. Emily took a breath, and the entire room seemed to lean in. She told them everything, how I had embraced her kindly after Thomas's death, how I had never blamed her for the choices of adults, how I had offered her tea and warmth the day she stood nervously outside my door with shaking hands and frightened eyes. She spoke of the letters I wrote her, filled with gentle advice and stories about the father she barely knew. She spoke of the birthday cards I sent even when she didn't respond, the small knitted scarf I made her when she turned 18, the way I tried, in my own imperfect way, to heal a wound I didn't cause. And then, her voice cracked as tears pooled in her eyes. "She saved me," Emily said, her voice trembling but strong, echoing through the silent courtroom. "When I lost everyone, she showed me kindness. She taught me forgiveness. She gave me what I never had, a mother figure. And she deserves better than this." The words fell into the room like stones dropped into still water, rippling through every rigid posture, every hardened heart. Even the judge paused, removing his glasses slowly as if he needed a moment to process the weight of what he had just heard. The courtroom grew impossibly quiet, no shuffling papers, no whispering from Claire, no stiff movements from Andrew. Just silence thick enough to feel. And in that silence, as I stood there trembling, a strange warmth bloomed in my chest, not victory, not vindication, but the fragile, flickering feeling of being seen. After a lifetime of holding broken pieces together, someone finally stood beside me. Even if that someone was the child whose existence had once shattered my marriage, she had now become the unexpected anchor in the moment I needed saving most. After a long pause, the judge looked at Andrew, and in that heavy, echoing courtroom silence his gaze seemed to cut straight through every layer of pride my son had wrapped himself in. "Mr. Collins," he began, his voice steady and calm but carrying the kind of authority that can soften even the hardest truths, "this is not a case about privacy. This is a case about resentment, miscommunication, and a son forgetting the sacrifices his mother made." The words hung in the air like a slow, deliberate toll of a bell, each one sinking into the wooden benches, the cold walls, and most painfully, into Andrew's rigid posture. Andrew swallowed, his jaw tightening, but he didn't speak. He couldn't. The judge leaned back slightly, assessing him with a mixture of disappointment and something almost paternal. "You should be grateful she is still here," he continued, and his tone shifted, gentler, but far more devastating. "Millions would give anything to have one more visit from their mother." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, a soft collective exhale, as though the truth of that sentence pierced not only Andrew, but everyone present. I felt my breath hitch in my chest, my heart squeezing painfully at the idea of all the people in this world who would do anything, just to sit across from their mother for one more cup of tea, one more laugh, one more hug. And yet here I was, being dragged into court for loving too much. The judge then turned to me, and his expression softened with a kindness I had not expected. "Mrs. Collins," he said, addressing me with a respect that sent warmth through my trembling hands, "you are welcome to visit your grandchildren on reasonable terms, and this court will not bar you from being part of their lives." I felt the weight I had carried for months, the fear of being cut out, the dread of losing the last pieces of my family, lift, just slightly, like a heavy curtain finally letting in a bit of morning light. He dismissed the case with a decisive thud of his gavel. Instantly, Claire burst into tears, loud and unrestrained, her hands covering her face as she shook her head in disbelief. She had come into this courtroom expecting a victory, a tightening of boundaries, a legal wall between me and their home, and instead she found herself on the losing side of a battle she never should have started. Andrew lowered his head into his hands, his shoulders curving inward, and for the first time in many, many years he didn't look like a grown man hardened by life and bitterness, he looked like my little boy again. The little boy who used to run to me with scraped knees. The little boy who cried when his father didn't come home on time. The little boy who once trusted me with every piece of his heart before life, grief, and anger pulled us apart. That image of him, small, fragile, overwhelmed, pierced me more deeply than any of the accusations written in that cruel court document. But the judge wasn't finished. His final sentence was what stilled the entire room, turning the air into something sharp and electric. "Mr. Collins," he said, leaning forward with calm firmness, "you owe your mother an apology. And I strongly suggest you give it." Several people gasped, even the bailiff beside me shifted in surprise. It is a rare thing for a judge to speak so plainly, so personally, especially in a civil hearing over family disputes. But his words struck like truth delivered with a hammer, unmistakable, undeniable. Andrew's shoulders tensed. His breath hitched. His face crumpled with a mixture of shame, regret, and something softer, something breaking open. For a moment, I thought he might look up at me, might whisper, "Mom, I'm sorry," right then and there. But he didn't. He just stayed frozen, small, undone. And in that moment, despite everything, I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I didn't revel in being right. I simply closed my eyes and let my tears fall quietly, tears not of triumph, but of exhaustion, release, and the bittersweet ache of a mother who had loved fiercely, lost deeply, and was finally being seen. That evening, Andrew came to my home, and even before he knocked, I sensed him on the other side of the door. A kind of heaviness lingered in the air, not threatening, not angry, just burdened. When I opened it, he stood there with his shoulders slightly hunched, his coat damp from a soft drizzle that had begun to fall, and his eyes carrying that same lost look I hadn't seen since he was a little boy unsure of how to confess he'd broken a window or forgotten his school lunch. He walked inside without saying much and sat at my kitchen table, the very same round wooden table where I used to feed him porridge on cold winter mornings, where I packed his school lunches, where I taught him how to count using sugar cubes, where he once sat swinging his little legs while telling me how he wanted to be an astronaut. Seeing him there felt like time folding in on itself, past and present sitting side by side. His hands rested on the table, fingers laced together, knuckles white as though he was holding onto something too tightly. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The kettle hummed softly in the background, warming the silence instead of breaking it. Finally, he exhaled, a shaky, trembling breath, and whispered, "Mom. I'm sorry." Just 3 simple words. But they carried decades of misunderstanding, anger, and unspoken wounds. And the moment they left his lips, something in the room shifted, a soft, gentle loosening of the grief I had carried quietly in the folds of my heart. I didn't need grand gestures, or long explanations, or tearful speeches promising change. All I needed were those 3 words, spoken honestly, vulnerably, by the boy I raised and the man I still loved fiercely. Families aren't perfect, they sway, they break, they drift apart, but they can also stitch themselves together again if even one person is brave enough to take the first step. We're not perfect now, far from it. There are still awkward pauses, still moments where old hurt flickers at the edges of our conversations, still days when he pulls away out of habit. But we're trying, both of us, and sometimes effort is more beautiful than perfection. Sometimes effort is love in its most honest form. Emily visits often, the daughter Thomas had in shadows but who stepped into my life like a quiet, unexpected blessing. She sits with me in the evenings, telling me about her studies, her little victories, her fears, and I see traces of Thomas in the way she tilts her head when she listens. Rebecca brings the children on weekends, sweet, energetic little souls who scatter toys across the living room, steal biscuits from the tin when they think I'm not looking, and fill the house with that light, tumbling laughter only children seem to know how to make. The house, once far too quiet, is full again, full of footsteps rushing down the hallway, mismatched cups left near the sink, half-finished puzzles spread across the living room floor, and tiny handprints on the window glass. Full of the kind of everyday chaos that warms the walls and makes a home feel lived in, loved in. And in the quiet moments, when the visitors have gone and the children's giggles have faded into memory, I sit in my armchair, the old faded blue one by the window, and I knit or read or simply watch the light change across the sky. Sometimes, when the world feels still enough, I whisper a small thank you to Thomas. Not for the pain, not for the secrets, but for the parts of him that still live on in every child he left behind. Emily's gentle eyes. Andrew's stubborn determination. Rebecca's warm laugh. They are all pieces of him, stitched into the fabric of my life. Life has taught me many things, more than I ever asked to learn, perhaps, but especially this: love is not always neat, nor tidy, nor easily understood. It is not always comfortable. Sometimes it bruises. Sometimes it shatters. But it is always, always worth fighting for. And if you're still listening, dear viewer, thank you for spending this time with me, for sitting with my memories, for allowing my story to rest in your heart even for a moment. If my story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. You never know, your story might help someone, too. Warm hugs, Margaret.